My name is Hannah Mercer. When I was 19, my parents told our church I was unstable, ungrateful, and dangerous to the family. What I had actually done was refuse to falsify the donation books for their scholarship foundation. In one weekend, I lost my tuition money, my room, my church community, and the last clean piece of my own name. They boxed my clothes, told people I had turned against them, and kept smiling in public like they were the wounded ones. For 9 years, they let that version of me live in other people's mouths. Then I became the state auditor assigned to review a $640,000 education grant tied to their foundation. That morning when I walked into the conference room, my mother still had the same soft voice, the same careful pearls, and the same expression people trusted too quickly. She kept that expression for exactly 23 minutes. It lasted until I asked for the vendor ownership disclosures. It lasted until I opened the ledger tied to a shell company they thought nobody would ever connect back to them. It lasted until the numbers stopped behaving like a testimony and started behaving like evidence. This is not a story about screaming in a parking lot or finally saying the perfect thing at the perfect time. It's a story about what happens when parents use faith, charity, and reputation to bury their own child. Then years later, that child comes back with the one skill they can't charm, shame, or pray away. Because the truth about my parents was never hidden in some dramatic secret. It was sitting in plain sight the whole time. Everything was in ink. Stay with me, because getting disowned was only the visible wound. What my parents hid inside those books was the part they thought would outlive me. And that part is what finally broke. When I was little, the Mercer Scholars Foundation lived in our house before it ever had an office. It lived in cardboard banker's boxes stacked by the piano. It lived in thank you notes drying on the dining room table. It lived in the smell of toner and coffee on Saturday mornings while my mother Grace sorted donor cards and my father Daniel worked the phone with the calm voice he used when he wanted people to feel honored for being needed. By the time I was 12, I could stuff scholarship packets, sort checks by amount, alphabetize receipts, and smile through donor dinners without dropping a tray or saying the wrong thing. People loved that about our family. They loved that we looked useful. They loved that my mother could remember every donor's sick aunt, every widow's birthday, and every pastor's favorite Bible verse. They loved that my father could stand in a fellowship hall with one hand on a folding chair and make sacrifice sound noble and organized. Our foundation wasn't huge back then. It gave out modest scholarships to local seniors, mostly first-generation college kids. Mostly families from churches that didn't have much but knew how to applaud generosity when they saw it. There were photos every spring. Smiling students. Oversized checks. My mother with one arm around a teenager in a cap and gown. My father one step back, humble in the exact way that still made him look central. I believed in it. That is the part people don't understand when they hear a story like this. They imagine I grew up suspicious or angry or secretly resentful. I didn't. I adored my parents for a long time. Not in a childish way. In a trained way. In a way that made my own value feel tied to how well I helped the mission run. When donors came over, my mother would touch my wrist and say, "Hannah knows the books better than some professionals." She said it like praise. I took it as praise. My father would laugh and tell people I had a mind for order, that one day I'd probably keep the whole operation from falling apart. That mattered to me. Because my life was wrapped around theirs. My college plans depended on the same household. The same donors who wrote checks because they trusted the Mercers. The same community that had already decided my parents were the kind of people worth backing. At 17, I thought the cleanest version of love was usefulness. I thought being let in was the same thing as being valued. The first irregularity I noticed was so small I almost talked myself out of noticing it. A donor named Mrs. Halpern sent a $5,000 check with a note clipped to it. The note said the money was for textbooks only to be split across scholarship recipients in the fall. I remember it because my mother made me reread it after dinner while she searched for a missing file. I entered the gift the way it was written. Restricted. Textbooks. Fall cycle. A week later, when I reopened the spreadsheet to prepare acknowledgement letters, part of that gift had been moved into outreach expense. I thought I had entered it wrong. I asked my mother about it while she stood at the kitchen counter slicing strawberries for some brunch after church. She didn't even look up. "It's all supporting students," she said. "The note said textbooks." She shrugged. "Donors say a lot of things in notes." I stood there with the spreadsheet printout in my hand, waiting for the rest of the explanation. She smiled, finally looked at me and said, "Numbers tell the story people can handle, sweetheart." I laughed then. Not because it was funny. because I thought I'd missed something obvious. Later I found other things. A restricted gift for science tutoring was partly shifted into event expense. A church offering designated for emergency student housing helped cover a gala deposit. A donor's summary sent to the board didn't match the internal working sheet I'd used to help prepare receipts. There weren't millions of dollars moving around. That almost made it worse. Everything was just clean enough to pass as judgment calls, and just off enough to make my stomach tighten. I started asking more questions. My father's answers were different from my mother's. That was the first thing that really got my attention. My mother always moralized. She talked about mission flexibility, seasonality, optics, donor fatigue. My father talked in structure, timing, cash flow, reallocation, temporary smoothing. He never sounded nervous. He sounded irritated that precision was being mistaken for principle. It evens out over the year, he told me once when I asked why a scholarship disbursement summary didn't match the bank report. It doesn't match now, I said. It doesn't need to match in May the way it matches in December. Then why did the board get the May number? He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, because people at a board table need the right level of detail, Hannah, not every level of detail. That answer stayed with me. So did the way he said people at a board table. Not board members, not volunteers, not oversight, just people. By the time I was 19, the foundation had grown enough to matter. Not statewide. Not yet. But enough for people to cite it in speeches. Enough for local papers to call my mother a quiet force in youth opportunity. Enough for churches to invite my father to talk about stewardship and service. Enough that an outside grant consultant had started helping prepare bigger funding applications. That consultant's invoices came through our books under a name I would not forget. Belmont Community Solutions. It sounded polished, generic, harmless. Community in the middle, solutions at the end. One of those names designed to make you stop asking what anyone actually did there. I remember the first invoice because it was for $12,000 and described the work as outreach coordination and engagement support. No hours, no detail, no deliverables. My mother told me to code it under program development. What program? The scholarship dinner, the mentoring luncheon, the pipeline work. What pipeline work? She gave me a look that meant I was being difficult in a way that embarrassed her. Don't say things like that with that face, she said. It makes simple work sound dirty. I entered it, but I printed the invoice first. That started a habit I did not name at the time. Not stealing documents, not collecting proof, just pausing before I let paper disappear. I noticed the foundation had more than one version of the truth depending on who was looking. There was the donor version, the board version, the working version, and then whatever version my parents carried in their heads when they said things would wash out later. My mother kept a red folder she called her clean copy file. My father kept bank mail and vendor paperwork locked in a rolling drawer in the den. The office post office box mattered more than the office itself. Some paperwork went there first. Some came home. Some never seemed to exist anywhere I could access without asking. Once, while helping prepare materials for a board meeting, I found two summary sheets for the same quarter. One showed stronger scholarship disbursements and lower admin costs. The other looked rougher but closer to what I remembered entering. I thought I had mixed up drafts. My father took both pages from my hand and said too evenly, "This one is internal. That one is for use." I waited. He added, "You don't hand raw scaffolding to people who only know how to look at paint." That was the moment something cold moved through me for the first time. Not because I fully understood the books. I didn't. Not yet. But because I suddenly understood that my confusion was not a bug in the system. It was part of the system. The summer before I was supposed to go back to school, the foundation was preparing new materials for a larger state education grant. It wasn't the $640,000 grant from years later. It was smaller then. An early-stage expansion request. But everything in the house tightened around it. My mother became sweeter in the specific way she got when she needed compliance to feel like affection. My father stayed up later in the den and closed files when I walked in. Then one Thursday night after dinner, my mother asked me to bring my laptop to the table. There were 3 entries she wanted recoded. 2 restricted gifts needed to be moved into outreach support. 1 event cost needed to be moved out of administration and into student engagement. She said it like we were changing labels on pantry jars. I stared at the screen. "These aren't coding corrections," I said. They are presentation corrections, she said. That isn't better. My father folded his hands and looked at me like he was waiting for me to stop performing adulthood and return to being manageable. Hannah, he said, we are not taking money for ourselves. That isn't the standard. My mother sighed. The soft, disappointed sigh she used when she wanted me to feel childish without ever having to say the word. The standard, she said, is whether the work gets done. The standard is whether the books are true. Silence held for one beat too long. Then my mother said, truth is not always a one-line entry. I looked from one of them to the other and realized with an almost embarrassing clarity that this was not the first time they had done it. It wasn't a special pressure because of the grant. It wasn't one bad season. It was the language they'd been speaking for years. I had just finally learned enough to hear it. My father slid the laptop an inch toward me. Fix the entries, he said. I didn't touch it. That was the last normal night I ever had in their house. I said no once. My mother blinked like she hadn't heard me correctly. I said it again slower. I told them I wouldn't change restricted funds, I wouldn't help prepare a false donor picture, and I wouldn't sign off on numbers I knew were wrong. My father didn't raise his voice. That would have been easier. He got quieter. Do you understand what you are saying? He asked. Yes. You're accusing us of fraud over bookkeeping judgment. I'm saying the books aren't true. My mother leaned back in her chair and looked at me the way people look at someone who has become inconvenient in public. You are too young to confuse conscience with arrogance, she said. I'm old enough to read. That was the wrong sentence. I knew it as soon as it left my mouth. My father took off his glasses, set them on the table with extreme care and said, if you plan to speak to us like an enemy, you should be prepared to live without what family provides. I thought he meant they were angry. I didn't understand yet that he meant they had already decided. The next morning my mother was normal. Too normal. She asked whether I wanted eggs. She texted me a grocery list. She kissed my cheek before leaving for the office. For 6 hours I wondered if maybe the whole thing had blown past us. Then my tuition portal stopped showing a balance due and started showing an unpaid hold. I called the bursar's office from my bedroom floor. The woman on the line told me the payment authorization connected to my account had been revoked. I asked if there was some mistake. She said very kindly, I'm sorry honey, but it looks intentional. I went downstairs with my laptop open. My father was in the den. My mother was folding towels. My tuition was pulled. My mother kept folding. We need a little time, she said. You cancelled it. My father looked at me over a spreadsheet and said, we are reassessing support. Because, I wouldn't change the books because you do not understand what loyalty requires. I remember the sound I made then. Not a gasp, not crying, something flatter, the sound a person makes when the floor they are standing on turns out to be movable. Support for school shouldn't depend on helping you lie. My mother set the towel down carefully. There it is, she said. That word again. Because it fits. She smiled, not warmly, just calmly enough to make me feel suddenly exposed. If you insist on making us your enemy, she said, you should stop expecting us to finance that choice. I don't remember the rest of that conversation in order. I remember fragments. My father saying I was being poisoned by pride. My mother saying the foundation had sacrificed for me for years. Me saying I would work, borrow, do whatever I had to do, but I was not changing those entries. My father asking whether I had copied anything from the office files. That was the first question that mattered. Not are you all right? Not what are you going to do? Not how can we fix this? Had I copied anything? I said no because at that point all I had were a few printed invoices and half-formed fear. He watched my face too carefully when I answered. By Sunday morning the punishment had become a plan. My room was no longer my room. It was a staging area. My winter clothes were in trash bags. Books were boxed. The framed photo from my high school graduation was face down on the dresser. My mother said it would be easier this way if I was determined to leave. I am not leaving, I said. You left when you chose accusation over trust, she said. That line traveled faster than I did. By noon 2 women from church had texted me some version of praying for your heart. A family friend told me my mother was very worried about my state of mind. One of the youth volunteers who had known me since middle school called and asked if I was safe. Safe from what I asked, and he got quiet in the way people do when they realize they have repeated someone else's language before checking whether it makes sense. I tried to talk to one of my closest church friends in the parking lot after evening service. She looked miserable the whole time. Your mom said you made some accusations, she said. I told the truth. She said, you were spiraling. I stood there in heels. I could barely feel and understood in one clean, humiliating second that my parents were not only cutting me off. They were getting in front of the truth before I had the money, status, or credibility to survive saying it out loud. By the end of that week, I had lost more than tuition. My student housing deposit failed because the family payment method had been removed. My mother told one aunt not to enable my instability. A church couple I had babysat for since I was 14 suddenly didn't need help anymore. My father sent me one email with the subject line boundaries and wrote 4 sentences about my choice to separate from the family until I could return in humility. At the bottom, he added, return any foundation materials in your possession. That was when the shame turned into something harder. Because people do not ask for the return of materials unless they are afraid of what those materials mean. I spent 3 nights on the pull-out sofa in the apartment of a girl from community choir whose mother barely knew me but hated self-righteous people on instinct. I worked a breakfast shift at a diner off the highway because they hired fast and asked fewer questions than churches did. I called my school deferred for a semester, then lost the semester anyway because a deferment without money is just prettier paperwork. Everything familiar became secondhand overnight. My own life sounded like a rumor when I tried to explain it. The worst public moment came 2 Sundays later. I should not have gone back to church. I know that now. But I had been raised there. My grandmother's funeral had been there. My first solo, my baptism, my volunteer hours, every shape of belonging I understood had happened under that roof. I think some part of me still believed that if I stood in the light long enough, somebody would look at me and see the difference between a liar and a daughter in shock. Instead, 3 people hugged me too tightly. One man avoided me entirely. And a woman from the missions committee pulled me aside near the coffee urns and said in a whisper she clearly thought was kindness, you don't have to punish your parents by making accusations just because you're disappointed. I did not correct her. I looked across the fellowship hall and saw my mother laughing near a tray of pound cake, hand on someone's elbow, face composed in that familiar shape of concern and patience. She saw me looking. For 1 second our eyes met. She did not look guilty. She looked relieved. That was the day I finally understood the full scale of what they had done. They were not trying to win me back. They were building a version of events that could survive without me. The next morning my father called and left a voicemail I listened to 3 times. He did not ask where I was sleeping. He did not ask whether I had eaten. He said, if you took copies of anything from the office, now would be a very wise time to return them before this gets uglier than it needs to. That was the voice that stayed with me. Not angry, not wounded. Strategic. They did not throw me out because I lied. They threw me out because I wouldn't. I didn't spend the next 9 years planning revenge. That would have been cleaner, almost easier. Revenge gives pain a shape. What I had instead was work, debt, humiliation, and a new understanding of how fast a whole community can accept a false story when the right people tell it first. But truth has a strange half-life. Even when it isn't believed, it doesn't disappear. It waits in corners. It repeats itself in patterns. It leaves fingerprints on paper. The first year after my parents cut me off, I tried very hard not to know anything about them. I changed where I shopped. I skipped town events. I stopped opening messages from church people unless I absolutely had to. I told new coworkers my family and I weren't close and left it there because the full explanation always made me sound either dramatic or naive, and I was too tired to be either on command. Still, things got through. A donor mailer landed at the old campus address I had briefly used when I still thought school might resume. Someone forwarded it to me because my name was on the envelope. The front showed 3 smiling scholarship recipients under a banner about changing futures. The back listed donors, board members, and program milestones in language so polished it almost made me laugh. There it was again. Belmont Community Solutions, credited for strategic outreach support. A year later, I saw a photo in the local paper. My mother in navy blue at a fundraising breakfast. My father standing beside a ceremonial check. The caption talked about stewardship, transparency, and expanding access. Transparency. The word sat in my throat like bad medicine. I started noticing the foundation from a distance, the way people notice old injuries when the weather changes. A church bulletin mention here. A donor luncheon there. A social media photo someone reshared with my mother standing under a balloon arch, hands clasped, surrounded by children whose futures looked good in the frame whether or not the paperwork behind them was honest. The foundation wasn't shrinking after I left. It was thriving. That mattered because it meant one of two things. Either I had misunderstood everything and my parents had gone on building something good without me, or what I had seen at 19 had not been a one-time compromise. It had been a system. And without an inconvenient daughter in the room asking dumb moral questions, systems like that tend to get more confident, not less. I still had a few things from those last months in the house. Not a dramatic archive, not boxes under floorboards, a couple of printed invoices I had shoved into a textbook. An old annual report draft saved to a cloud folder I had forgotten about. 2 email chains I had forwarded to my student account because I was trying at the time to untangle which numbers had changed between drafts. One of those emails included my mother's sentence: "Move the Halpern restriction to outreach support so the year-end picture doesn't look top-heavy on materials. We can normalize later." Normalize later. I read that line maybe twice a year for a long time. Not to stay angry, to stay sane. Because memory changes shape when enough people deny it around you. Paper does not. Around year 3, I heard the foundation had received a much larger state-linked grant opportunity. Around year 5, I learned they had expanded staff. Around year 7, a county paper called them a model partner in educational equity. Every update landed with the same quiet force. Whatever they had built on those early distortions had not collapsed under its own weight. It had become respectable. That was the scariest part. Not that bad people got away with something. That good packaging had made the bad thing look useful enough to protect. I kept living. I kept working. But in the back of my mind, under all the practical noise of survival, one thought hardened into a rule. If I was ever going to trust myself again, I had to become the kind of person who knew exactly what those books meant. I started at community college because it was what I could afford while working. I took classes in the morning, worked afternoons at the diner, and stocked shelves 2 nights a week at a grocery store that smelled like overripe peaches and floor cleaner. I stopped studying what I had once imagined for myself and moved into accounting, then compliance, then public administration. People like to romanticize reinvention. They make it sound brave and clean. Mine was stubborn and ugly. I didn't choose accounting because I loved columns. I chose it because numbers had been used to break my life, and I needed to understand how that happened without anyone being able to smile me out of the answer. When a professor explained restricted funds, I felt my pulse in my wrists. When a guest speaker talked about internal controls, related party transactions, and why small nonprofits often collapse under the weight of informal trust, I went home and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. Every useful thing I learned felt like touching an old bruise and finding bone under it. I transferred to a state school once I had enough credits and enough money pieced together from grants, work study, and one scholarship that had nothing to do with my hometown or my last name. I interned in a county office that handled community development reimbursements. I learned how requests are documented, how invoices are tested, how matching funds are verified, how people try to hide private benefit inside public language. There is no glamour in that work from the outside. You sit in fluorescent rooms. You compare numbers across forms that were never designed to make sense on the first pass. You ask for support for entries people hoped nobody would revisit. You write emails that sound dull and kill careers. I loved it, not because I was bitter. Because the whole field was built on a simple premise my parents had violated the night they threw me out. Trust is not the same as exemption. I never told most classmates the real reason I cared. When they joked about becoming fraud bloodhounds, I smiled. When they complained about documentation requirements, I didn't. I understood too well what happens when a charming person gets to define what counts as close enough. Years passed in that quiet way they do when nobody is watching you anymore. My apartment got better. My jobs got steadier. I stopped flinching every time someone from back home viewed my profile and didn't message. I built friendships with people who knew me in the order I had actually become myself, not in the order my parents had announced me to a room. And every now and then my old life brushed against the new one. A regional conference booklet listed my mother on a panel about donor trust. A faith-based newsletter quoted my father on intergenerational service. The Mercer Scholars Foundation received a major education access grant, $640,000. When that file landed in my review queue years later, I knew the foundation name before I consciously read it. The body knows certain threats faster than the mind admits them. I was in my office half drinking bad coffee, moving through standard assignment notices. Subrecipient review. Program compliance test. Documentation request matrix. Then there it was. Mercer Scholars Foundation. For a second, all I could hear was the bursar's office telling me my tuition authorization had been revoked. I pushed my chair back from the desk so hard it hit the cabinet behind me. My supervisor Ellen looked up from across the room. "You okay?" I brought the assignment packet to her immediately. "There's a conflict," I said. "Foundation leadership are my parents." She read the first page, then looked at me in that practical, unsentimental way good supervisors do when they know emotion exists but cannot be allowed to steer the process. "Document it," she said. "I'm serious. So am I. I can recuse. You can. Or we can manage it." I waited. She asked, "Can you do the work clean?" "Yes." "Can you do it without freelancing, grandstanding, or trying to settle your childhood in a conference room?" "Yes." "Then disclose it in writing and I'll assign Malik as co-review. Every request goes through the shared file. Every contact is documented. You don't touch this alone." That was the most respected I had ever felt in my life. Not because she was kind. Because she was precise. She did not ask whether my parents had hurt me. She did not soothe me with language about closure. She asked whether I could do the job and then built a structure where the job could be done correctly. When I opened the preliminary materials later that day, I found the first anchor point within minutes. A vendor summary showed repeated payments to Belmont Community Solutions. The name hit me with such force I laughed once under my breath. Still there, still dressed in neutral language, still attached to outreach, support, engagement services, and community pipeline strategy. I pulled the invoices, round amounts, thin descriptions, no attached work product. I pulled the grant budget. Belmont had been paid across multiple categories in ways that were technically possible and logically rotten. I pulled the related party disclosure packet. No Belmont ownership connection reported. Then I pulled the W-9 on file. The phone number listed for Belmont matched an old office line I knew by heart. Not a similar line, not a close line. The line. That was the moment I knew I was not looking at sloppy books or overworked nonprofit administration. I was looking at design. If you've ever been turned into the problem because you would not help family lie, then you know this part matters. The day I saw that vendor name in the file, I understood I had not survived 9 years just to be believed. I had survived long enough to become dangerous to the exact system that had erased me. The site visit was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I did not dress for revenge. I dressed for work, navy suit, low heels, hair pulled back, thin gold studs. The kind of outfit that says I am not here to be memorable. I am here to be exact. Malik drove because Ellen thought it was wise for me not to arrive full of my own heartbeat. He was a good auditor, and an even better human being because he understood the difference between curiosity and intrusion. He knew the broad disclosure. He did not ask for the family history. Halfway there he just said, "We stay in the file." "We stay in the file," I said. The foundation office had moved since I was 19. No more boxes in our house. No more bank drawer in my father's den. Now there was a clean brick suite near a medical plaza with frosted glass on the front door and a vinyl mission statement in the lobby. Hope. Access. Legacy. The words looked expensive. A receptionist led us to the conference room. My mother was already inside. Time had refined her instead of softening her. Her hair was lighter. Her suits were better. The pearls were real now, not church lady imitations. She stood when I walked in, and for one naked second before training rushed back over her face, she looked exactly like what she was. Not graceful, cornered. "Hannah," she said. I put my folder on the table and said, "Good morning, Miss Mercer." Malik introduced himself. My father walked in 10 seconds later carrying coffee and stopped hard enough that some of it hit the lid. He did not say my name first. He said no. It was the most honest word I heard from him all day. Then the performance arrived. Surprise became composure. Composure became public warmth. "Well," he said, recovering, "look at you." I did not smile. He tried again. "We're proud of what you've done." That sentence might have landed differently if he had ever used it when it cost him nothing. Instead, it just sat there between us like an invoice nobody planned to pay. I opened the meeting. "We're here for the scheduled program review tied to the State Education Access Grant. As outlined in the notice, we'll be testing expenditures, controls, vendor support, scholarship file completeness, and related disclosures." My mother's hands folded perfectly on the table. "Of course, we're happy to cooperate." That word "happy" almost interested me. Not because it was false. Because she still thought language could shape the room faster than the documents on the table could. For the first 20 minutes we stayed technical. Grant budget variances, reporting timelines, scholarship recipient tracking, board oversight, subcontracted outreach work. They were smooth. Not flawless but smooth. My father answered in broad, confident strokes. My mother filled in emotional texture talking about community need and staff burden and the complicated beauty of serving students in a difficult funding environment. She was still excellent at making resistance sound uncharitable. Then I asked for the Belmont contract file, work product logs, and beneficial ownership disclosures. My mother blinked once. My father said too casually, Belmont is just support. Then the support file should be easy to produce, I said. It's all in the invoices. Invoices are billing instruments, Malik said. We also need deliverables. My father turned to him with a smile that was meant to recruit male reason against female rigidity. These were flexible engagement services. Malik said flexible is not a deliverable category. I watched my mother realize in real time that the old room dynamics were not going to return for her no matter how well she performed. She asked the receptionist to bring additional binders. While we waited, she looked at me with an expression she probably thought read maternal and only managed to read proprietary. We never imagined seeing you like this, she said. I kept my eyes on the request sheet. That makes one of us. A little later my father asked whether he could speak with me privately. Malik looked at me. I nodded once. We stepped into the hallway outside the conference room where framed photos of smiling scholarship students lined the wall like moral wallpaper. My father lowered his voice. You don't have to do this here. I said nothing. He took a breath and tried a different angle. Whatever grievance you have with us, this is not the place to settle it. There are students involved, staff, donors, reputations built over decades. You should have thought about that before submitting false support. His jaw tightened. You are assuming facts. I'm requesting them. He leaned closer. Family handles family in private. That was the moment the whole 9 years narrowed into one clean line in my chest. No, I said. Family was private when I was 19, and you asked me to change the books at our kitchen table. This is public money. This is public trust. And you don't get to call me family because there's a records request on the table. He looked at me like he had been slapped. Good. He straightened, regrouped, and went cold. You always did mistake rigidity for virtue. And you always mistook access for innocence. We stood there for 1 second more than was comfortable, then I walked back into the conference room without waiting for him. That was the actual power shift. Not the title, not the assignment, not the suit. That hallway, because he finally understood he was not talking to the daughter he had exiled into dependency. He was talking to a professional with a documented process, a witness 2 seats away and nothing left in her life he could still take. The binders arrived. They were worse than missing documents. They were padded documents. Overproduced. Sloppy in the specific way people get sloppy when they assume volume can impersonate support. Belmont invoices repeated generic phrases across quarters. Board minutes referenced vendor approval but had no attached conflict review. One signature page had clearly been printed separately from the body of the minutes. A reimbursement log for outreach events cited student contact work that somehow always rounded to clean numbers and never generated attendee records we could verify. Malik flagged 3 items in as many minutes. I asked who at Belmont supervised the contracted work. My mother answered, they work independently. Name the supervising contact. She paused. I'd need to confirm. I looked down at the W-9. The contact line on this tax form is your office number. That's administrative carryover. The mailing address is a private mailbox. That's common for vendors. The invoice sequence tracks across your grant and donor-funded expenditures. She said nothing. My father stepped in. You're reading malice into efficiency. I finally looked straight at him. No, I said. I'm reading pattern into repetition. He looked away first. By noon we had enough inconsistencies to escalate the file from routine review discomfort into formal concern. We documented missing deliverables, incomplete board support, undisclosed related party indicators, and unsupported vendor charges across grant categories. My mother changed tactics near the end. She softened her whole face and said, Hannah, whatever happened years ago, this foundation still does real good. Hurting it hurts students. That line would have worked on the 19-year-old me. The girl who still believed mission could purify method. The woman in that room had a different standard. The students were hurt, I said, the moment you decided your image mattered more than clean books. Silence dropped hard. The receptionist who had been bringing files in and out all morning stopped moving for a second near the doorway. My father said, "That is enough." I said, "Not yet." Then I requested direct support for every Belmont payment tied to the grant, all ownership records, staff communication related to outsourced outreach services, and the full bank reconciliation support for the quarters under review. My mother's smile did not come back. When the meeting adjourned, she sat perfectly still with both hands folded over a binder labeled stewardship. It would have been funny if it weren't so late. Tell me honestly. Once the people who raised you start reaching for family only when the paperwork turns against them, do they still deserve private mercy? Or do they deserve the record exactly as it is? Vindication did not arrive in one dramatic envelope. That would have made a better movie and a worse truth. It arrived the way real exposure arrives. In layers, in cross-checks. In the death of excuses. The first clean break came from the ownership trail. Belmont Community Solutions had been treated in foundation records as an independent vendor. Its W-9 listed a private mailbox. Its invoices were vague. Its work product was almost non-existent. The foundation represented Belmont as a flexible outside support provider that handled community engagement, donor coordination, and recipient tracking overflow during heavy grant cycles. But when we pulled the state business registration and matched it against the tax file, the structure started collapsing immediately. The registered organizer on Belmont's formation papers was not some outside consultant. It was a former administrative assistant who had left the foundation years earlier but still shared a mailing contact tied to the same office services center my parents used for overflow records. The listed phone line on an amended filing matched the foundation office. The email domain used for vendor correspondence routed through the same server block as the foundation's admin accounts. That alone was ugly. It got uglier when we matched the invoice chronology against the foundation's internal email production. Because yes, after the site visit they had to produce emails. And inside those emails were the seams. My mother directing staff to push Belmont through before quarter close. My father asking whether certain donor-facing summaries could avoid clutter around outsourced outreach. A staff member asking where to file Belmont deliverables and another staff member replying, "Grace said, there are no separate materials, just process. Just process." That phrase almost made me smile. When people can't produce the work, they start elevating the abstraction. Malik handled the email testing while I worked the expenditure support against the bank packet and board file. The more we examined, the worse Belmont looked. Payments billed as community engagement did not tie to attendance logs. Recipient tracking charges overlapped with work already budgeted to foundation staff salaries. A set of consulting expenses hit both donor-restricted funds and the state grant in ways that suggested the same thin service description had been used to drain multiple pots of money at once. Then we found the transfer chain. Not direct theft into my parents' personal checking account. They were too practiced for something that obvious. It was more respectable than that. More nonprofit, more deniable. Grant-linked and donor-linked funds paid Belmont. Belmont paid a second account for event production and strategic communications. That second account paid for gala staging, private travel tied to donor cultivation weekends, and several charges that served my parents' reputation machine far more clearly than they served any student. You could tell exactly how they justified it to themselves. If the image stayed strong, the money stayed flowing. If the money stayed flowing, the mission stayed alive. If the mission stayed alive, then the distortions weren't really distortions. Just necessary smoothing by adults who understood how the world worked. Fraud almost never introduces itself as greed in good people's clothing. It introduces itself as stewardship under pressure. The witness piece came from the board, though not the way my parents expected. One longtime board treasurer, an older certified public accountant named Linda Chavez, sat for our follow-up interview with a face that told me she had already begun doing the moral math on her own. She confirmed that Belmont had never been clearly disclosed to the board as a related operational dependency. She said she had assumed it was an independent specialist firm because that was how management spoke about it. When we showed her the thinness of the support and the overlap in contact data, she took off her glasses and said very quietly, "Then they did not tell us what this was." That sentence mattered, not because we needed her outrage, because we needed her clean understanding. Later that same afternoon, Malik flagged a signature issue in a board approval packet. One set of minutes referenced review of vendor structure and conflict controls for Belmont. The draft metadata and printing sequence suggested that approval page had been generated later than the rest of the packet. Linda looked at it and said she did not remember that discussion ever occurring. Again, not drama, precision. Then came the piece I had carried for years without knowing whether it would ever matter. I had disclosed my history. I had not volunteered my old documents because this was not my personal crusade. But once the related party indicators and coding patterns lined up with the historical structure, I remembered Ellen asked a careful question. Do you have any contemporaneous records from your time assisting the foundation that would show prior treatment of restricted funds or use of Belmont? I went home that night, opened an old cloud folder I hadn't touched in years, and found the email chain in under 10 minutes. I read it twice before sending it through counsel. My original question, 19 years old and still trying to sound respectful. Should the Halpern textbook restriction stay under materials or shift with the outreach adjustments from today's working sheet? My mother's reply. Move the Halpern restriction to outreach support so the year-end picture doesn't look top-heavy on materials. We can normalize later. Also route the Belmont line under program development, not admin. Donor eyes are on ratios. Donor eyes are on ratios. That email was 9 years old. It did not prove every present-day violation by itself. What it did prove was pattern knowledge and intent. It proved that the coding behavior under review was not an innocent response to recent complexity. It was embedded logic. It proved my parents had once asked me to do exactly what they later suggested I had imagined. When counsel added that chain to the review file, something inside me went very still, because I had spent so long thinking vindication would feel hot, righteous, triumphant. It didn't. It felt quiet. Like hearing your own name pronounced correctly after years of people getting it wrong on purpose. The formal findings followed over the next weeks. Unsupported vendor costs, failure to disclose operational relationships, inadequate board oversight, improper allocation of restricted and grant-linked expenditures, insufficient documentation for deliverables billed to public funds, potential recovery exposure, required corrective action, funding freeze pending response. The words came in memos, notices, response deadlines, and board communications. My parents tried at first to overwhelm the process with narrative. They submitted long explanations about mission demands, administrative fluidity, and evolving service models. They emphasized outcomes, student stories, community trust, years of sacrifice. The file did not care. The file wanted support, and support was where they failed. I attended the response conference remotely with Malik and Ellen. My parents were there with counsel. So was Linda. The board chair looked pale. My mother wore cream and kept her posture so straight it looked painful. My father tried one last time to sound like the adult in the room, correcting procedural overreach. Then counsel asked the Belmont ownership question again. Not poetically, not with anger, just with enough exactness to leave nowhere clean to stand. My mother answered first. Belmont was a facilitation vehicle. That phrase hung in the room for half a second. Counsel said, for whom she swallowed, for outsourced support, owned by whom? Silence. My father spoke. The structure evolved over time. Counsel repeated, owned by whom? It was Linda who finally closed the distance. Grace, she said, not cruelly, just answer the question. My mother's hands tightened. Administrative control was internal. That was not a denial. That was not a misunderstanding. That was as close to a confession as people like my mother ever come, while still hoping language can save them. Nobody said the word ministry after that. Nobody said stewardship either. Just controls. Failures. Misrepresentation. Recovery. Remediation. Exposure. The dictionary of holiness vanished the second the room had to behave like a room full of adults. In the weeks that followed, the public part of the collapse unfolded mostly through formal channels. The grant froze. The board demanded outside review. Belmont disappeared from public-facing materials almost instantly, which told me more than any press statement could have. A local reporter eventually called the situation an administrative controversy. That irritated me for about 4 minutes, until I remembered that the most satisfying part of justice is not how newspapers describe it. It's how people who thought they were untouchables start answering in writing. My mother kept smiling until I opened the shell company ledger. After that, everything that had protected them had to pass through evidence. I want to know what you would have done at that point. Once the proof is clean, once the people who buried you can no longer call you unstable without contradicting the file, do you soften because they're your parents? Or do you let the truth stay exactly as sharp as it earned the right to? Being proven right did not make me feel young again. It did not return the semester I lost. It did not repair the years I spent explaining my family in fragments because the whole version sounded too cruel to be believed casually. It did not make the church parking lot disappear from my body. Vindication does not reverse history. It only stops lies from owning the future. After the findings, my parents began reaching for me again, not publicly at first, privately, carefully, as if the right tone might still let them rewrite the shape of what had happened. My father sent the first message, short, controlled. He wrote that the matter had become larger than it needed to, and that despite our differences he hoped we could speak as family before others continued to misinterpret administrative mistakes. That phrase told me everything I needed to know. Not because he was angry. Because even then, after the memos, the freeze, the disclosures, the board fracture, he was still trying to downgrade choice into mistake and fraud into interpretation. I did not answer. My mother tried next. Her email was longer, more personal in style. She said she had been thinking about me constantly. She said the process had become painful in ways nobody could have predicted. She said she knew there had been failures on all sides. She said she wanted coffee not to discuss the case, just to reconnect as mother and daughter. Failures on all sides. That line almost impressed me. There is a particular talent some parents have for turning unilateral harm into mutual sadness so they never have to name what they did. I drafted 7 replies and sent none of them. Then, after a week of silence, she left me a voicemail. I listened to it once while standing in my kitchen with a dish towel in my hand. "Hannah," she said softly, "I know you are hurt. I know we all made choices under pressure. But there has to be a path back from this. I don't want the rest of our lives defined by one season when everybody was scared and trying to protect what mattered." That was when I finally understood the last thing I had been waiting to understand. My parents were not incapable of grief. They were incapable of truth that cost them rank. That is different. If I had met her for coffee, she would have cried. She might even have meant some of it. She would have talked about fear, stress, burden, ministry, scrutiny, survival. She would have widened the story until accountability dissolved into pain management. And if I let her do that, then all I would be doing was giving the lie a more intimate room to live in. So I called her back once. I kept it short. She answered on the second ring, breathless in a way that told me she had been rehearsing hope. "Hannah, no," I said gently. "Listen to me first." She went quiet. "I am not meeting privately to help you reframe what happened. That's not what it is. Maybe not in your head. But in effect, yes." She started crying then. Real tears, I think, not theatrical. That would have moved me once. It didn't move me enough now. "We were under so much pressure," she said. "You don't know what it was like keeping that place alive." "I know exactly what it was like," I said. "You asked me to help you do it with false books." Silence. Then a whisper. "We did good things too." There it was. The final defense of people who cannot deny the wrong. Balance the scales morally with outcomes. I took a breath. "Maybe you did. But good things do not cancel deliberate lies. They just make them harder for people to believe." She cried harder at that. I did not raise my voice. I did not call her names. I did not tell her she had ruined my life. I said the one thing I needed her to hear clearly enough that it could not be softened later. "You didn't lose your daughter when the review started," I said. "You lost me when you asked me to lie and then told the world I was dangerous for refusing." She made a sound like something had dropped inside her. I let the silence stay. Then I added, "If you want to tell the truth now, tell it where it belongs. In writing, to the board, to counsel, to the people you misled. But I am not going to sit across from you and help you make this feel like a family misunderstanding." I hung up before she could answer. That call was not revenge. It was surgery. After that, I made one more decision that mattered almost as much as exposing the books. I stopped trying to get my old community back. There was a version of this story where I marched into the church that had believed them and waited for shame to bloom on other people's faces. There was a version where I forwarded findings to everyone who had ever sent me a prayerful text about my attitude. There was a version where I needed the town to choke on my parents' hypocrisy in order for my own life to feel restored. I did not choose that version. Not because I was above anger. Because I finally understood something hard and freeing. Some witnesses are not recoverable. Some audiences are not owed your whole file. Some people will quietly revise their opinion of you and never say a word. Some will stay loyal to your parents because good works are easier to worship than clean character. Some will pretend the truth was too complicated to sort out because complexity protects them from admitting they backed the wrong people. I could live with that. What I could not live with anymore was letting their version of family define my responsibilities. So I set terms. No private meetings, no phone calls unless initiated by counsel or tied to formal process. No emotional bargaining through cousins, pastors, or old family friends. No accepting we all made mistakes. No allowing grief to substitute for confession. The board eventually restructured leadership. Outside oversight came in. Scholarship administration was separated from the old internal culture my parents had treated like inherited property. Students did not vanish from the map. That mattered to me. I did not want innocent kids paying for my parents' choices. Real care for students had always been the thing my parents borrowed language from. I was not interested in becoming so consumed by exposure that I helped destroy the legitimate need underneath it. That distinction gave me peace. I cooperated where I was supposed to. I signed what I needed to sign. I stayed inside the process. Then I stepped back. In the months after, I noticed a change in myself that had nothing to do with them apologizing because they never really did. I stopped reacting to my own last name like it belonged to a stranger. For years, Mercer had felt like a logo someone stamped over my face. A thing associated with other people's certainty about my parents and my alleged instability and the version of me that had been useful until it became inconvenient. I had considered changing it more than once. Maybe I still will someday. But after the findings, I signed one internal acknowledgement with my full legal name and stared at it on the page longer than I needed to. Hannah Mercer. Not because they deserved the word. Because they didn't own it anymore. That is what boundaries gave me. Not softness. Not reunion. Not a tidy moral ending where broken parents finally see the light and a brave daughter forgives from a place of cinematic peace. Boundaries gave me the right to stop negotiating reality. The truth had done what it needed to do. It had corrected the record where correction mattered most. In the systems my parents used to protect themselves. It had forced paper to tell the story people could not charm their way around. It had exposed the fact that the daughter they disowned had not been unstable, ungrateful, or dangerous. She had just been the first person in the room to say no. And maybe that is why this still sits so heavily with me. Not because I won. Because I was right from the beginning, and being right was never what cost me my family. What cost me my family was their need for me to be wrong. If the evidence were this clean, would you expose your own parents? If you've ever been turned into the villain for refusing to lie for family, what did that cost you? And when the people who raised you finally cry after the truth comes out, do you think they deserve forgiveness? Or just the record they worked so hard to escape?